Hello! Better day today. Well, I'm at least in better spirits. It's not like anything bad happened yesterday or anything particularly good happened today, though I did get a watch today. I bought a watch. Because I need a watch. Especially for my comp, because the clock is behind me and other people writing will be behind me, and I don't want to have to do that thing where I'm looking at the clock and, like, it seems suspicious. I just want to be able to look at my wrist. Especially since we got the questions in advance for the comp. We got 10 questions in advance, 6 of which are going to be on that exam. It's for 2 classes, so over the entire year, with 2 different profs, so it will be 3 for one prof and 3 for another prof. 3-hour exam that gives us half an hour to write on each. And then that's why they have the oral comp after the weekend, so we write on a Friday and then we go in for like an hour on the Monday and talk, because there's no way to be able to test our knowledge of an entire year in one 3-hour exam, because either we write like 2 essay questions in 3 hours and we do those really in depth but miss out on a bunch of stuff from the class, or we do it this way, which is smaller questions, more part of it, and speaking to the profs, basically what you do is you gesture to something that you know. Like, that involves epistemologies of ignorance. Don't have time to explain right now. I'm writing 6 questions in an hour, in 3 hours. And then they read that, and so when you have your oral comp, they say, well, you mentioned recognizing this is connected to epistemologies of ignorance. Could you explain that? And then you, which then says, well, yes, I understand what epistemologies of ignorance are. I understand more fully how they're connected. I didn't have time to write that down. And you basically have a conversation with the profs. At least that's how they're toting it. I've been told by several profs, like, don't worry about this, don't freak out about this. I'm worrying and freaking out about it, but maybe, I want to say maybe that's not just me, that's just me, it's not. Spoken to a couple other students who are writing this comp, they're sort of feeling the same way, which is just, but that's actually on my, like I told you a couple times, that is the last thing on my list. So there's a couple things before that point that I need to get through. But it is the first thing that we've sort of been handed, and reading over the questions. It's going to be interesting. Different styles for each prof, but also different authors. The first semester was really sort of the canon of philosophy and political philosophy. So starting with Plato and going through Aristotle and Locke and Rousseau and Kant and Hegel and Nietzsche, ending with Freud. Freud was the last one we did with that class. And then what was super interesting is this semester has been a lot more modern authors. We never got as far back as we did with the other class. Like, that was sort of the purpose of the other class, was here's the canon of political philosophy, and then this one, we do have some older people, such as Foucault, like we did him, but we're also doing a lot of more modern things, so people who are still alive. Donna Haraway is one of the immediate ones that are coming to mind. Bruno Latour, we just did. Like, a lot more modern thinkers. So, a much more modern look at political philosophy. So before, it was this discussion of reason or contractarianism, how societies came to be formed, and I found with this one it's a lot more how societies continue to function rather than how they've formed. So things like, how do we have gender relations, how are those functioning, how are race relations functioning, epistemologies, but ignorance is a big one, which is this idea that you can have things culturally or societally that you know, but you're actually telling a story to say that the thing doesn't exist. The big one, of course, is racism. It is this question of systematically, is there something still happening that in some way we're saying isn't, which was Charles Mills with the racial contract, is saying that it's written itself out of the legal law. Like, it's no longer legal to discriminate. But it's developed into such a way that there are still certainly symptoms of it. Systematically showing up under everything. And the same with the gender question. So it's a much more modern look at things. And then as the semester came through, we started taking a look at people who weren't necessarily trained as philosophers. Like Haraway was actually trained as a scientist. Oh God, I'm trying to think of who he is. We have his text. No, we didn't. That was online. But we had another one where we were looking at philosophy of science. Bruno Latour's specific one is actually a discussion of sociology. And so we're looking at how different philosophies of other social sciences and hard sciences are starting to come in and show up and work through all of these things. So, like, it's been a super interesting class. Some really hard thinkers on both sides. Like, all the way back. And you're never, with a class like this, you're never going to reach full understanding. Because by comparison, last semester, one of the other classes I did was Continental Tradition. And this semester, it's English Liberal Tradition. And each of those we focused on 4 political philosophers specifically. This semester, it was Hobbes. Oh God, no. We didn't start with Hobbes. Yeah, no, we started with Hobbes. Filmer, Sir Robert Filmer, who's not as well known, which is why I struggled. Considering I wrote a paper about him, I shouldn't have struggled that much to think of his name. Locke, and Mill. And not Charles Mills, but Mill, who wrote Utilitarianism. So that, like, considering I have one class where we're literally doing a text or several shorter texts, such as articles, a week, versus 4 books in a semester, and then the other class that I did last semester was just on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So, like, you get an idea of how you can do this. Like, we can spend an entire class talking about one of these texts. Like, an entire semester class talking about one of these texts. So, and still not get all of it. Like, there are so many interpretations of the ethics that you're not going to be able to get all that even in one semester completely. And a lot of people will argue, I think including myself, that you're not going to be able to get somebody's full argument from just one of their texts. Which makes, when you're learning about these people through this entire semester of social and political thought, we've been doing a text a week, but we've been doing, for the most part, like, one text. Or parts of one text, as it were, last semester. And this semester, because, like, Latour we did 2 weeks on, because we read an entire text for him. But then Kuhn we just read sections of, and things like that. So it's hard because you're never going to get their full argument from that one text because they can build off of it. Nietzsche is a really good example where he has several texts that actually build off of each other. A lot of people say Marx wouldn't have been a Marxist because a lot of Marxists use his early work and not his later work. A lot of people talk about how you can't know Plato from just reading one of Plato's dialogues, even if it's the Republic, which is one of the big ones. Like, you need to read all of his dialogues. And the Tour, same thing. Like, super interesting text, really hard to understand. He uses a lot of terms differently, and they're not always defined the way we're expecting them to be, or defined clearly. And then you sit in the class, and the prof can say, "Oh yeah, one of the big parts of his argument shows up in this other text that we haven't read." Happened with Filmer, and like we actually had our text of Filmer was a collection of some of his bigger writings, and straight up like the professor was like, "Oh yeah, one of the big arguments that Locke goes against, which is why we had to do Filmer first, is just a throwaway line in this not well-known text." And we're like, what? Like, Locke has his two treaties, and they're called the two treaties, and no one reads the first one because the entire first one is arguing with Filmer, and no one reads Filmer anymore now because he is a scripturalist, so he bases all his argument on scripture, which nowadays is not a good argument because it's based fully on this one thing that if you don't take scripture to be an authority, then his argument is blown out of the water because... So it's sort of interesting, and it's become, I think, an issue in the class because a lot of times I am just trying to understand what is going on within these texts. Like, I don't have an opinion if this is right or wrong, I just want to know what's going on. And I have a lot of these people, like, I have to do a lot more reading for. So doing the comps is going to be interesting because... Explain epistemologies of ignorance. Well, okay. We talked about a lot of people this semester. And I've got half an hour to write about it and an hour to talk about it. A lot of the times, like, this class does not make me feel smart. Because it just reminds me that there are all these other people who have published just reams and reams of work. Like, we read some of the Federalist Papers, and thanks to the musical Hamilton, I am just... Like, it's this moment where you recognize this person literally wrote like he was running out of time. He wrote constantly, to the point where sometimes his wife wrote and he dictated because his hand was just... And I'm not that type of person. I can do this. I'm just gonna say that's just gonna be my mantra, and you're gonna hear it all this month. It's just, I can do this. Talk to you tomorrow.